Okay, talking about net zero, on May 18th, this report was released by the International Energy Agency, the net zero by 2050 roadmap for the global energy sector. So I'm going to just take few figures from the executive summary and make a little podcast just to add on to the net zero discussion I had from the Nature paper on how to enhance the net zero goals. The main message from this report is that there is a narrow pathway to make it to net zero by 2050 in the energy sector. If you remember our emissions, global emissions pie chart, energy sector emits almost 75% of the annual emissions right now, and we also know that we should have started to ramp down emissions by 2020, as we are sitting here in 2021 May, heading to the mid-year mark already. But COVID is here, all kinds of economic downturns had happened, and lots of climate actions got delayed, pushed back, and are being hopefully ramped up, led by the US again. So let's run through some main messages. Key clean technologies ramp up by 2030 in the net zero pathway. Obviously that includes looking at the energy sector. 2020 the solar and wind here, so solar PV and wind have to ramp up by 2030 by 4 times, and of course a large part of it comes from solar PV, and then wind also grows in terms of the gigawatts capacity additions. Electric car sales, which are growing but not as impressively as you would hope, have to jump by 18 times, so in millions of cars here have to go from about I don't know 3 or so to almost 55-56 million cars. And energy intensity of the GDP. This is always something critical. We have to track the energy intensity of GDP and then carbon intensity of the energy, right? So megajoules per US dollars, PPP, purchasing power parity, that's kind of the metric that's used by economists. So we have in 2020 the energy intensity of GDP is up here about 4.5 megajoules per USD. PPP has to go down by 4% per year by 2030. So these are to start with, and then expected annual emission savings in the net zero pathway relative to 2020 by then are 2030 and 2050. Behavioral changes, you can imagine that that's not going to be a great contributor. It probably unlikely that putting up signs everywhere saying don't eat meat, don't travel, don't buy too many things you don't need, use clothes till they are old and torn, and so on and so forth, have some impact. Peer pressure works, but that cannot be counted on, whereas technologies in the market, especially for cement, steel and other industrial activities, can accomplish a lot of CO2 reduction by 2030, or more than about 80% if you take out this part here. And then technologies under development for treating iron for the steel industries and various processes in the cement industry, which are high emitting industries, will add a little bit. But by 2050 behavioral changes will add some, but the technologies in the market will play much less of a role, because newer technologies under development will have to contribute much more here. Okay, so that's kind of the goal. And this fortunately also comes with global employment in energy supply in the net zero pathway by 2030. So this is looking at millions of jobs in bioenergy, electricity, coal, oil and gas, and you can see the distribution here in 2019. The expected growth in the electricity and bioenergy is up here, and there will be losses by 2030 in oil and gas and coal. We hope coal will definitely be going down, but the employment has to be more than made up by these other industries like electricity and bioenergy. And by 2030, here you have a mix of 2030. Coal has not completely disappeared. There is no chance that it will happen. In the other podcast, I showed the various timelines set by even countries like Sweden, Germany, Norway, Denmark for ramping down coal, and that's not necessarily a good sign for 2030 ramp down. And there is electricity and bioenergy employment increase by or contribution by 2030. So employment has to be there to be able to make these socio-technical transitions, otherwise it's just not going to happen, right? The report lists several priority actions. I picked one here. I'll show some others with charts. Set near-term milestones to get on track for the long-term goals. So governments need to provide credible step-by-step plans to reach their net zero goals, building confidence among investors, industry, citizens, and other countries. This is very critical. Of all the Paris Agreement signatories, many countries like China and India are not necessarily equipped to sacrifice economic growth to reach net zero, and China has already presented net zero plans for 2060. India has had discussions but has not presented any plans, has not put up any policies yet, but they have to be encouraged to come forward. This has specific key steps for these time horizons of 2020, 2021, 25, 30, 35, 40, and so on to 50. I will show that in the next slides. But looking at the reduction in CO2 along the way to zero in buildings, transport, industry, electricity and heat, and other, the key drawdowns have to happen by 2030. 150 million tons low carbon hydrogen, 850 gigawatt electrolyzers. So obviously this will be part of the net zero pathways. 4 gigaton CO2 captured by 2035. 435 million ton low carbon hydrogen again by 2045, so energy transition there, and also for use in steel and cement industries. 3000 gigawatt electrolyzers for iron ore processing, for example, and 7.6 gigaton CO2 captured by 2050. What are the key steps? 2021, no new unabated coal plants approved for development. So phasing out coal power plants is one thing, but not allowing new ones is a key factor as well. No new oil and gas fields approved for development, no new coal mines or mine extensions. So now you know why international cooperation is so key. Top-down plans for the future obviously will have severe barriers and oppositions unless there is a solid plan to have players buy into these plans. And key steps: 2025, no new sales of fossil fuel boilers, big step. 2030, universal energy access, part of the sustainable development goals as well. All new buildings are zero carbon ready. 60% of global car sales are electric. 60%, that's a large number. Most new clean technologies in heavy industry demonstrated at scale. Expectation, not an easy one. 10-20 gigawatt annual solar and wind additions. Again, another goal that has to be carefully planned out. Phase out of unabated coal in advanced economies. I mentioned Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, US, Australia, and so on, but that's a critical step as well. 2035, most appliances and cooling systems sold are best in class. 50% of heavy truck sales are electric. No new ICE car sales. Internal combustion engine car sales have to stop. All industrial electric motor sales are best in class. Overall net zero emissions electricity in advanced economies. By 2040, 50% of existing buildings are retrofitted to zero carbon ready levels. 50% of fuel used in aviation are low emissions. around 90% of existing capacity in heavy industries reaches end of investment cycle. 90% existing capacity in heavy industries. Net zero emissions electricity globally, already met by 2040. Phase out of all unabated coal and power plants. Phase out of all unabated coal and power plants, which means those that are capturing carbon and have other technologies to reduce emissions are still around. 50% of heating demand met by heat pumps. Okay, we have talked about heat pumps before. 2050, more than 85% of buildings are zero carbon ready. More than 90% of heavy industrial production are already low emissions. Almost 70% of electricity generation globally from solar, PV and wind. 70% of all electricity generation globally from solar, PV and wind. Right? Global energy security indicators in the net zero pathway. So this is looking at 2020 and 2050. Oil supply, million barrels per day. And this is million tons here. So 50. This has to ramp down here, million barrels per day to this level. Here 34% is by OPEC share. It will be 52% in 2050. Critical minerals demand. This is what has to be watched out for. Any goal we want to meet have to track where the bottlenecks could be and where the capacities have to be met. 2020 and 2050. So lithium and other things that are needed. Share of solar PV and wind in electricity generation 2020, and we said 70% by 2050. So global energy related CO2 emissions in the net zero pathway and low international cooperation case. Generating international cooperation for meeting these key steps along the way and implementation of the key technologies, existing and new ones along the timelines, is going to make it possible by 2050. But if cooperation is not met, we're going to push it out to 2090, and this has to be translated to warming, of course. Whether it will stay within 1.5 or 2 by 6 with 66% probability or not. That is going to have other cascades that we are not talking about here. Okay, so that's a quick run through and a short summary, executive summary, but I hope it adds to the overall geoengineering aspects that we've been talking about and the global carbon cycle. We talked about the future of global carbon cycle in the global carbon cycle primer course, and we talked about the future of carbon in the geoengineering aspect. So these net zero and net zero pathways fit into both, so I will place them in the appropriate folder and you can find it and follow up. Okay.